Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's ZNCD Climate Action webinar, Reuse and Transform. AIA California has developed the Climate Action webinar series to address various climate action topics, including zero net carbon design mandatory continuing education. We will provide links in the chat box where you can find our climate action webinars and free ZNCD on-demand education. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides the learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the presentation resources that can be made available online. A few quick housekeeping reminders before we get started. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available on the AIA California website, www.aiacalifornia.org. Today's session qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units and 1.5 hours of ZNCD mandatory continuing education. For those who stay on and watch live, AIA California staff will report these units for you and will send you a ZNCD certificate of completion. It may take several days before credits are posted to your AIA transcript and before certificates are received. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Finally, cultivate a positive learning environment. AIA California strongly encourages attendees to be constructive in their comments and questions to the presenters and to one another to ensure we have a session that is productive and an environment that is a positive learning experience for everyone. I'd now like to introduce our moderator and speaker for today. Larry Strain, FAIA, Lead AP, is a founding principal at Siegel & Strain Architects, an award-winning 20-person firm with a focus on community projects and sustainable design. And next we have Susie Marzola, AIA, Lead BDC, is Managing Principal at Siegel & Strain Architects. Susie focuses her considerable energy on the design of projects that are rooted in place and community, and that marry mission to design solutions that reflect vision, capture imagination, and achieve the highest levels of sustainability. We have Allison Hyatt, RA, is a project architect at Siegel & Strain. Allison has a passion for reducing whole life carbon emissions associated with the construction of buildings and infrastructure. She has broad experience designing projects that range from small tenant improvement projects to phased multi-building campuses and master planning within national parks. And we have Laura Levenberg, AIA, Lead BDC, is a project architect at Siegel & Strain. Laura has a passion for collaboration, quality design, social and environmental sustainability, and has experience ranging from programming to all phases of design to construction administration and attention to detail at every step of the process. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to our panelists today. Thank you so much for being here and looking forward to your presentation.
All right, thank you. Let me try sharing my screen now. Okay, and then let me go to view and slideshow. All right, that was amazing. I did that. Okay, here we go. So good afternoon. It's great to be here. We're going to talk about reusing and upgrading buildings and why that's critical to critical climate strategy. We're also going to talk about why we also have to transform the buildings we live and work in. Most building owners and users don't reuse buildings to save carbon. They do it because they love the building, they can't afford to build a new one, or because it's a piece of the community that's important to save. We're going to talk about the improvements that capture the imagination, increase use, and make a difference in people's daily lives. Oops, let me get this on here. Now, why is it not advancing? Oh, there we go, learning objectives. There we go, I'll get this down. There they are. I'm not going to read them all for you, but they are on the website when you get this later. So overview, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give some context for why reusing and upgrading our buildings is important. And then you'll see 3 very different reuse case studies, and then we'll try and sum it up at the end. So you've probably seen a statement like this before, and it's a true statement, but it's not the whole story. It's true because the building a new building releases a lot of carbon. The embodied carbon is the first thing that gets released in a project. And for new buildings over the next 20 years, about 60% of its total emissions will be the embodied emissions from building it. But that's just for new buildings. operating existing buildings is still responsible for the majority of emissions from the built environment. And these are major cities, well, except for Bellingham, major cities around the world. And how much of that energy emissions from those cities just comes from operating buildings. The other point to remember is that 2/3 of our global building stock that exists today will still be with us in 2040, which is the year Architecture 2030 says we need to be at net zero for our buildings. Policies like Local Law 97 in New York have begun to mandate emission limits for existing buildings. It's a really great start, but we need to move faster and more aggressively. A few important points to note. This law only applies to buildings greater than 25,000 square feet, and it's also taking too long. Local Law 97 was enacted in 2019, but the new greenhouse emission limits don't go into effect until 2024, and they're already talking about delaying that for another 2 years. So in the meantime, we really need architects and engineers who are working on existing buildings, especially the smaller projects that aren't covered by laws like this, to advocate for investing in upgrades to existing buildings. Here's why we need to pay attention to residential buildings, which is a lot of the scale building we'll be looking at today. The blue phases, the blue hues in these pie charts are residential. On the left is by floor area, and on the right is by number of buildings. So we have a lot more residential buildings in this country, and even by floor area, it's 2/3 of the built buildings that we have that are built. The other thing to remember about this is that what would be covered by Law 97 is the areas outlined in green. Nothing else is even covered. So it's larger buildings, and it's not going to be it's not going to cover a whole lot of what we build. So these laws are great, and we have to keep working on this even when we don't have a law to support us. To get to net zero by 2050, which is what most of the world thinks we need to do, and even if we say that instead of 2040, all buildings will need to be upgraded. We currently renovate about 1% of our buildings every year, which is the solid blue line on the bottom. To get to net zero by 2050, renovation rates must increase to 3% per year if we start right now. And if we start later, the graph gets steeper. So the line gets steeper. So you can see that we got to get there. And the faster we do it, the faster we make these renovations and upgrades, the better we'll be. As I said at the beginning, there's lots of reasons we renovate buildings. The AIA conducted a survey to understand what the primary reasons for pursuing building renovations are. And the reasons given were adaptive reuse, interior modernization, tenant improvement projects. Farther down the list were shell and system upgrades and energy performance. As architects, we need to be advocating to add decarbonization efforts to every project, even the ones at the top. So we can't ignore the energy upgrades and the shell and improvement upgrades. We've got to start making those just happen every time we touch a building. And pointing out to our building owners that improving performance also saves money and benefits the building users. So why invest in building reuse? Mostly we're talking about improved environmental performance and decarbonization, but we also are talking about investing in existing communities. And you can remind the owner again that it's almost always cheaper to reuse a building than to build a new one. So the greenest building is one that's already built, but it's also actually the one that's been retrofitted. We can't afford to leave those existing buildings, even if when we save them and reuse them, we can't afford not to retrofit them. And you'll see that demonstrated as we go through the projects. There's a new tool available that to help make this easier, to help make the carbon case for reusing and upgrading buildings easier. In February of this year, Architecture 2030 launched the CARE tool. It's designed to do quick upfront carbon estimates comparing a reuse project to a new replacement building. I've been working on this tool for more than 3 years, along with Aaron McDade of Architecture 2030 and Lori Ferris, who's currently chair of AIA COAT this year and the Zero Net Carbon Collaboration. It estimates total carbon emissions, operating and embodied, of reusing and upgrading a building compared to replacing it with a new one. It's not really a design tool. it's a pre-design and planning tool to help make the case for reusing and upgrading a building before you even have a building designed. It's basically letting you make an upfront evaluation of, does this make sense to reuse, or do we need a new building from a carbon standpoint? Here's a quick summary of what gets entered into the tool. The tool comes, and you'll see a little bit further on what it looks like. The tool comes with 4 tabs across the top: general information about the project, information about the existing building, information about the building reuse scope, and the new building scope. Under general information, you enter the location, which sets your climate zone and also sets your default grid emissions. And you can actually modify the grid emissions. You have a tab to allow you to do that depending on your state, because right now it comes with current grid emissions, and you can change that. And then you set the time frame you want to model it for. And we recommend setting a time frame of 20 years because that's the period of time we're trying to reduce the carbon in. And we want to see if we're succeeding in the next 20 years, not in 30 or 40 or 50 years. When you go to the existing building tab, you enter the building size and height, the type of structure of the existing building, the building use, which will give you the EUI, the typical EUI for that building type. And it'll spit out the EUI for that building. For the building reuse, you enter any changes to the size and use. You enter a target EUI, like what's your goal for how good you want to make the EUI, how low you want the EUI to go, and that's based on what your goals are, what you think you can do. And then you enter the reuse scope, and that's broken down for the embodied carbon. That's broken down into the structural system, the envelope, the interiors, the mechanical and electrical and plumbing systems, and any additions that you might have made to the building. For the new building, again, it's size and use. If that's different from the original, you enter that. Again, a targeted EUI and the building type of the new building. And here we give you 3 choices. It's either a wood frame building, a hybrid building, which is wood plus concrete and steel, which is like affordable housing over a parking deck or something like that, and then concrete and steel buildings. And these give you basic embodied carbon footprints for those building types, and then it translates into emissions by the size. When you've entered all that, you get a chart that the one on the upper left is basically the embodied and operational emissions over the time frame you've entered. So in this case, 20 years. The light blue is operational emissions and the dark blue is embodied. So you can see the existing building when you do nothing to it and leave it alone. It's all operational, and it's basically 80,000 tons of in this example, 80,000 tons of emissions. The reuse and addition, it's about 35,000 tons of operational and a little bit of embodied emissions. And the new building has the same operating, we're assuming the same operating emissions, but the embodied emissions are about double to build this new building. You can also look at it over time. So you can see that the green line is the existing building, just keeps on operating. And it basically, the reuse and addition becomes better than that after year 2, and then it's better from there on. And the new building isn't better than the existing building, leaving it alone until you get to about year 8. So it gives you a quick way of looking at not only what's the total emissions you're going to make, but when are you achieving savings over what you had before. So it's really important to start to see how fast the savings are. Some of these ones you'll see eventually the new building will be better than all of them, but it might be 40 years from now if it's more efficient. So that's useful information to have. And then you also get the actual emissions on the chart at the right. This all comes out when you've entered everything. This is what it gives you. So you can see the EUI intensity for the do nothing building is 145. For the reuse and addition was 69. The new building would have been 100. So that's how it looks. This is what it looks like when you go to the website. It's at caretool.org. And when you get to the front page, if you just scroll down a little bit, the tool just appears. So the blue thing will be at the top. And as you scroll down, there's the tool, and you just start working on it. There are ways to save your results. It says print results, and it saves it as a PDF. So you can look at all of the results and keep it. Otherwise, it just every time you start a new project, it throws out the old ones. So that's how it works, and we're pretty excited about it. We are. Let's see what my next slide. I'm going to go back one for a second. This currently works at one building at a time. And we're planning on adding next year a portfolio feature, which will allow universities, developers, planners to evaluate portfolios of buildings to understand potential savings at a larger scale. We also need to beef up the data we have on single-family residential projects. There's very little data for embodied carbon on single-family residential because most of the LCA studies have not been for residential. And even the MEP systems are different for residential. So those need to be changed a little bit. And we're going to use the CARE tool. After each case study, we'll show you the results. We ran each case study through the CARE tool, and you'll see how it works. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Allison now to show you one of the first project.
Great, thank you. So our first case study is Berkeley Hillel, which is a Jewish student center adjacent to UC Berkeley. The building provides spaces for students to gather, to study together, and to explore their Jewish heritage through community service or by getting to know others in the community. The building was originally constructed in the 1950s, and there was a renovation completed in the 80s. And then design work for our renovation began in 2015, which was really before people were talking extensively about electrification and embodied carbon. Next slide. Okay, so here the 1980s renovation is pictured on the left with Siegel and Strain's renovation on the right. In both renovations, the first floor is partially below grade and accessed off of the courtyard. The upper two floors are predominantly wood frame construction, and those are accessed off of the main stairway that you see on Bancroft Way. Next slide. So to understand how Hillel envisioned this building transformation, we started by engaging with the students and the staff. We held a series of student listening meetings with different groups of students. And from those, we learned that the students really valued gathering spaces where they could connect with their peers and spaces that provided a connection to the outdoors. We also held meetings with staff who wanted the renovation to provide safe, comfortable, and flexible spaces for all students and enable the organization to serve more people in future years. We also considered how the building could extend beyond UC Berkeley and serve the larger Bay Area Jewish community by occasionally opening the space up for private events. Next. Okay, and then looking at the before and after plans, the existing building was kind of funky. It had a lot of curved walls and these long, narrow rooms that prevented the spaces from being used to their full potential. So in the renovation, we reconfigured all of the building's offices, meeting rooms, collaborative workspaces, and the auditorium, while also expanding the usable outdoor space. That involved adding a courtyard at the first level and adding 2 decks on the second story off of either side of the auditorium. Next slide. And one of the most important spaces in the building is the chapel. In the existing building, the chapel was located at the very back. It had pretty low ceilings, and it didn't have access to much natural light. So then in our renovation, we moved the chapel to the front of the building where it would be overlooking the street. We exposed the vaulted ceilings, and we did that to give the space a stronger presence. Next slide. We also expanded the size of the students' collaboration spaces and located them more centrally to help students feel more connected to every part of the organization. So on the plan to the right, you can see the collaborative space borders the chapel, the staff offices, and then it's also the first space that you see as you're coming up and down the stairs. Next slide. This is a before and after of the lobby and the student lounge space at the second level. This space was kind of tricky to design because of security concerns that Hillel had. So you can see before our renovation, the building couldn't be closed off from the public, and students walking through the building were really cut off from daylight and views outside. And then after the renovation, The lobby could be physically separated from the rest of the building with these deployable doors. And even with this added layer of security, we were able to open up the sightlines between the lobby, the lounge, and then the auditorium beyond the lounge space to help students and staff feel connected to each other and connected to events that are taking place throughout the building. Next. And then another big focus of the project was on improving comfort for students and staff. So sometimes comfort meant providing students with clear views into staff offices to know when might be a good time to approach. Other times it meant providing comfortable lighting levels using either natural light or new LEDs. And we also paid a lot of attention to building envelope and mechanical system upgrades to improve the thermal performance of the building. Next slide. And then in terms of flexibility, the existing building was full of these really tight spaces like you see on the left. The revised design offers rooms that are large enough to take on multiple different uses while still providing opportunities for smaller groups of students to either sit alone or meet with a few closer friends in a more intimate space. And this level of flexibility has enabled Hillel to host events more effectively, better accommodate current students, and also support more students as time goes on. Next slide. Okay, so what did this process look like? The first point that I wanted to highlight is Berkeley Hillel is a nonprofit and they had pretty limited funding for the renovation project. So this meant that we had to be really strategic about what upgrades were most important to pursue now and which could kind of wait until later. We worked with a building science consultant to provide guidance on envelope upgrades. And although we didn't conduct energy modeling during the design process, we did conduct a whole building life cycle assessment after construction was completed. We also brought the contractor on board pretty early on in the process so that they could participate in existing building evaluations and inform our envelope upgrade decisions. Next. In terms of what did we actually upgrade, for envelope upgrades, we added insulation at the walls and ceilings. We replaced about half of the existing single pane windows with double pane, and we added air sealing. For MEP, we upgraded the existing systems, but we did not electrify them. Again, this was before electrification was a no-brainer, and at the time, we wanted to avoid upgrading the electrical service because that would have had pretty significant financial implications for the project. So with these pretty minor envelope upgrades, we were able to achieve an 18% EUI reduction. And after we completed this project, we looked at how the building was performing and we thought, okay, well, we saved embodied carbon and we saved operational carbon, so we did a pretty good job. But after running tally and kind of revisiting the project and the CARE tool, we saw that the results painted a slightly different picture. So what's up on the screen now, these are our embodied carbon emissions associated with the project. We have the estimated emissions from the original construction in gray, and then the emissions from our renovation are in the red color. So you can see that we spent about half as much embodied carbon as we would have if we had rebuilt the same building with all new materials. Next slide. And then these are our CARE tool results. You can see that our building renovation in the center column performed ever so slightly better than the do nothing and the new building scenarios on the left and right. And although we did reduce embodied carbon emissions by about half compared to a new building, these results just show how big of a role operational carbon was playing in our renovations emission profile. Next. Okay, and then now looking at the graph on the right, you see the building reuse case in dark blue takes over 20 years to surpass the do nothing case in green, which is a pretty long payback period. So that kind of brings us to our lessons learned, which The first one is the importance of considering both embodied and operational carbon together when making decisions about whether to renovate or build new. At the time of this project, we thought that we were doing enough by just reusing the building, but it turned out that we should have been paying just as much attention to energy upgrades. And one of the biggest missed opportunities was not electrifying the building, particularly because we live in a state with a very clean electric grid. And then the other big upgrade that would have improved building performance was reducing infiltration. So that brings us to point 2, which is to tie the sustainable design features to the client's interest. This means we have to identify what's most important, quantify the value added, and then find a way to tie that added value to the things that the client cares about. So on this project, the client's primary concern was cost, which is probably true of a lot of projects. And we had originally specified 2 blower door tests to help us meet our air sealing targets. But those tests got value engineered from the project because we didn't have the supporting data to articulate how those blower door tests would save the client money. And it turned out that not being able to quantify that value from the client's perspective really hurt our energy performance. Next slide. Okay, so number 3 is reduce concrete and cement. I think this point is probably pretty obvious to most people now, but it's still an important one. We had originally proposed a wood deck supported by a hybrid steel and concrete system. And during construction, the deck structure got value engineered to a fully concrete system, as shown on the right. This solution was both easier and less expensive for the contractor because they didn't have to coordinate as many subs. However, the change added about 20% more concrete to the original proposed deck design, and it led to a 15% increase in carbon expenditure above our original proposal. I think if we had understood the magnitude of this change and had the numbers to back us up, we could have made a stronger case for either sticking with the original design or reducing the carbon intensity of our concrete mix. Next. Okay, and then lastly, all foam is not created equal, so it's important to be thoughtful when specifying insulation. We had originally assumed that we would add mineral wool exterior insulation above the roof sheathing, as shown on the left. But after meeting with our building science consultant, we were advised that spray foam would be a better option for air sealing because of all of the unknown existing conditions. So we ultimately ended up proposing a roof assembly very similar to the middle image. We were very careful to use only a small amount of spray foam. We specified it only where we had vaulted ceilings, and we kept the foam to the minimum depth of 3 inches. But even with all of those efforts, after we ran our embodied carbon analysis on the right, the spray foam was still one of the top contributors to embodied emissions on the project. And I think knowing what we know now on future projects, we would really advocate for a different air sealing solution before defaulting to spray foam. Next. So all in all, although this renovation didn't perform quite as well as we would have liked from an environmental standpoint, we did learn a lot about what it means to take a holistic approach to reducing carbon emissions. And we now have a much clearer understanding of how to prioritize and advocate for sustainable building upgrades on future projects. And then from a social standpoint, this project was really successful. The building has been embraced by the community, and the reconfigured indoor spaces, the deck, the courtyard, and the strengthened connection between these areas has transformed how students use the space and interact with their peers in and around the building. And that wraps up our first case study, and I'll now hand it off to Laura to talk about the Boys and Girls Club.
Okay, thank you, Allison. I'm going to talk about the renovation of another building here in the East Bay. It's a Boys and Girls Club in San Leandro. In addition to the building that we worked on, the organization provides programming at 11 other locations and also provides service in the nearby town of San Lorenzo. So they reach a lot of people, about 2,600 young people every year. Prior to our involvement with the club, starting mostly in 2018, the 50-year-old Boys and Girls Club building was a really beloved part of the community, but was outdated and focused primarily on sports and recreation uses. Whereas the club at that time, they were ready for a change and to move in a more contemporary direction, focusing on 3 main pillars, which were academic success, healthy lifestyles, and character development. The other thing that was happening around the time that we started working with the organization is that they experienced a shift in the way that they delivered their programming to the youngest kids, who were part of the club. So they, instead of coming to the Boys and Girls Club building that we worked on, those kids accessed services directly at their school campuses, which allowed the facility that we worked on to be freed up for transformation into a teen center. Of the 1,300 kids who are served every day by Boys and Girls Club, about 700 of those are teens. And this is the only dedicated teen center in the area. So it was a really important and much needed amenity. Next slide. Looking at the plan of the building and site prior to renovation, you can see that there was almost no outdoor space for kids. It's almost all dedicated to cars and parking. The main entrance to the building was on the north side, which is plan left here. And the interior of the building includes a gym, a multi-purpose room, a kitchen, and a large open game room that was really lacking in character and purpose. Surrounding that game room, highlighted in the light orange tone here, are many small enclosed program rooms that were dark and inflexible and lacked transparency and connection. Next slide. The renovation included taking over some of the parking for outdoor play space and reorienting the main entrance, flipping it to the south side of the building at a safe, dedicated drop-off area close to the parking lot. The gym remains in the building and it continues to be a really important part of the program, but not the heart of the program. The heart is now the central hall, which functions sort of like a quad for the building. It's the arrival point for teens, and it's connected to all of the various program spaces around it, which are again highlighted in light orange here. And while the central hall is smaller than the game room used to be, the space that came out of it went into making the program rooms more generous. The rooms also they have more glazing than they did before, and there are bifolding dividers between rooms, so they're much more visible and connected than before. And lastly, in both this plan and the existing, or the pre-renovation, I should say, there's a swimming pool on the right side, which is operated by the city of San Leandro and was not part of our renovation. Next slide. The building was originally constructed in 1966 with concrete tilt-up walls at the large gym and pool volumes. They're higher than the rest of the building. CMU exterior walls surround the lower portion. It's labeled here program spaces. And this area has wood-framed interior partitions and a wood-framed roof structure. And that's the area that we focused on with our renovation, with only a very light touch at the gym, and again, no scope at the pool. Next slide. So as the club looked forward to its transformation into a teen center, the visioning process included engaging with teens and staff, as well as other stakeholders, and to determine what people needed and wanted in a renovated building. And the overarching goal that came out of this was that people wanted to enhance the benefit that the organization brings to the community. So similar to Hillel, they wanted to serve more people and have a place that the greater community could use for events. And they wanted a safe space. It was also important to the club to promote those 3 pillars that I mentioned at the beginning of academic success, healthy lifestyles, and character development. Next slide. And they wanted a space that was more contemporary for the teens that would come there. When they interviewed teenagers as part of the process, those kids mostly said that in the absence of a teen center in their community, they like to hang out at Starbucks because it was this cool environment with music playing, and they could get something to eat or drink and hang out with friends or sit at a table and do homework. And it was really important to the club's leadership that the new teen center have that kind of casual environment that's not home and it's not school, but it's somewhere that teenagers want to spend their time. Next. It was also important to better utilize all of the spaces that the club had in the building. The somewhat lifeless game room on the left here was transformed into a bright, daylit central hub of activity from which many of the other spaces are visible. Again, it's that idea of a quad from which place teens can see into other rooms, know who's there, and decide if they want to join in the activity. Next. Prior to the renovation, there was a single teen room in the building, and it was completely enclosed and isolated, just with one tiny little window to the outside. Whereas the new spaces are open and connected to other program areas and to the outdoors. And the spaces are flexible with a collection of offerings that are purposeful yet reconfigurable. Next. The computer lab has been transformed into a light and open tech lab where the young people can learn about graphic design, coding, sports analytics. They have access to things like 3D printers and a recording studio here. So it's an updated and contemporary version of the computer lab of the past. Next. So finally, a portion of the parking lot was converted into much needed outdoor activity space that's an extension of the usable indoor program spaces. Next. So how did we get here? The process started with the critical step, or I guess it wasn't the first step, it happened throughout the project, but a really critical part of the process was to help the club take advantage of what they knew was a really big opportunity. It was their once in a generation shot at transforming their building. So in addition to all the programmatic aspects that I've already touched on, that meant addressing issues with their existing building, like acoustics, thermal comfort, and daylight. A voluntary seismic upgrade was a chance for them to give their teens a safe place to be, which was high priority and a matter of equity for the club. And of course, throughout the project, we worked closely with our consultants at every step of the way. And again, like Hillel, the client brought a contractor on board early in the process to advise on constructability and provide cost estimates. The design timeline was driven quite a bit by donor schedules, funding and donor schedules. And it was really quite a sprint to get from schematic design to permitting, meaning that we did not have time for energy modeling during the design process. Instead, we relied heavily on lessons learned on past projects about what would improve performance the most. Next. While also leveraging the owner's priorities into sustainable design features. So in this case, the owner valued acoustics and upgrading their acoustics because they're right next to a BART track and it's really loud. And mitigating that issue with new windows and skylights also meant a higher performance envelope. Same thing with thermal comfort, insulating the envelope to improve comfort for occupants in the building also led to higher performance. And we made sure that all the improvements to the building did double duty as much as possible. So for instance, the bifolding glazed partitions between program spaces were about providing flexibility and connection between rooms, but it also was a way to bring daylight deeper into the building. Another major upgrade to the building was new HVAC or electric heat pump HVAC systems for all of the program spaces. Unfortunately, natural gas did remain in the building for the kitchen equipment water heating, and the spaces that weren't in our scope, like the gym, HVAC system, and again, the pool. So next slide. And what we've learned in analyzing our building since it finished construction a couple of years ago is that the building underwent a 38% reduction in EUI, and the PV array that was installed offsets all of the building's electricity use. One caveat with all of this, one caveat is that the pool isn't included in the analysis because it wasn't part of our scope, but we know it does use quite a bit of gas, which is unfortunate. So next on the care tool analysis here, it's pretty clear to us that the renovation project is the better alternative from a carbon emissions perspective than either new construction or doing nothing. And when we look at this in terms of cumulative emissions over time, at year 0, the new building emits twice as much carbon as the reuse. So again, a pretty clear case for reuse. When we aren't even thinking about anything like cost, for instance, but we couldn't resist thinking about that. And our back of the envelope calculation is that a new building would have cost probably at least twice as much as the renovation, which would have been a non-starter for the Boys and Girls Club, as it would be for many of our other small nonprofit clients. Next. So in terms of lessons learned on this project, one was to incorporate iterative energy modeling into the design process and the workflow to ensure that it happens on every project. It may have been extra at some point in the past to energy model our projects, but going forward, it needs to be the norm. Another lesson learned is to, similar to what Allison described on Hillel, but to have metrics on hand so that when cost-saving measures are proposed during design or construction, we have data to present to our clients. So it needs to be also in a metric that matters to our clients. So if it's money, that's great. We can talk about money. Maybe somebody cares more about how many trees are cut down or metric tons of carbon. Whatever it is, it speaks to our clients' values. That's what we should have on hand to talk to them. Next slide. We also were made aware on this project of being wary of initial cost savings that might come at the expense of embodied carbon. On Boys and Girls Club, in order to save a little bit of money up front, the owner decided not to do any geotech investigation, thinking that, well, it's an existing building, what's going on with the soil probably isn't that important. But it turned out that it resulted in foundations that were oversized, potentially by as much as 2 times. And there weren't very many foundations on this project, so it probably didn't result in a huge amount of carbon here. But if we were to have this same thing happen again and again on multiple renovation projects, it would add up to a lot of carbon. Plus, the modest savings in upfront costs was probably negated by the money that the owner spent during construction for extra concrete and excavation required for the larger foundations. Next. So the last lesson learned that I want to talk about is being prepared for the future. In this retrofit, as well as at Hillel, we were able to upgrade all of the layers of the building shown in this diagram. Possibly most importantly, on both projects, we did seismic upgrades, which was a great way of preparing for the future and set up both buildings to continue operating for another 60 to 200 years. And while sometimes seismic upgrades are very carbon intensive, in these cases, the upgrades were relatively low in embodied carbon and mostly included the addition of hardware, tying a roof structure to the walls and walls to foundations. Next. So one other aspect of planning ahead is understanding as much as possible about the future electrical loads in the building and upsizing the electrical service accordingly, because for most organizations, a renovation project is the one chance to pursue an electrical service upgrade. The Boys and Girls Club renovation did include a service upgrade to accommodate the new HVAC systems, plus some wiggle room for loads in the future. But we didn't fully account for everything. There have been some EV chargers added and unexpected program expansion, like this great little cafe that's pictured here in a shipping container. It's a place for job training for teens, so it's a really exciting program. But when we first talked about it, it was estimated that it needed about 50 amps of electrical service. And as the program evolved and grew, it ended up needing 200 amps. So between the cafe and 4 EV chargers, there isn't enough electrical capacity remaining to electrify their existing natural gas powered commercial kitchen, which is unfortunate. So of course we can't see the future, but it's important to do our best to try to anticipate and plan for all of the future needs and get the most out of an electrical service upgrade with our one shot at it. And next slide. So with that, I'll hand it over to Susie to talk about a completely different type of transformation project.
Thank you, Laura, Allison, and Larry. Yes, now for something a little different. The project I'm going to talk about is the Oakland Eco Block. It's one of 12 grant-funded pilot projects that was selected by California Energy Commission through its Advanced Energy Community Program. And the project team here is led by the University of California, Berkeley's California Institute for Energy and Environment. And in this program, grant-funded project, we are exploring, and at times it feels like bushwhacking, a pathway for decarbonization by promoting resilient PV systems in existing underserved communities. Next. Anyone who has ever attempted to electrify their existing homes knows what it takes and that it's not an easy endeavor. So with this block approach, what we're aiming to do is to address local and state mandates at a larger scale and a faster pace. Oakland, for example, has a goal of electrifying all existing buildings by 2040, which includes about 100,000 of these types of homes that were built before 1960 and any energy codes. What we're also seeking to do is to build neighborhood resiliency on many fronts and in a way that could rid all of our homes in our cities of natural gas, not just a select few. And then finally, we're looking for opportunities to save money and time. A contractor can move through a block with greater efficiency than working on one house project at a time. So next. The characteristics of our existing residential block are typical of those throughout Oakland. The buildings are a collection of relatively small 1- and 2-story wood-framed residences constructed between about the early 1900s and the 1980s. Next. What will transform this block into an eco block are improving this collection of buildings through energy efficiency upgrades and electrification retrofits. We'll be installing a co-owned roof-mounted PV array on each of the participating properties, which will be linked and connected together. The community or the neighborhood will share an EV and will install a curbside charger. About 60% of the participating residents, when polled, said they would forgo their second car if they had a car that they could share as a community. And finally, if funding allows, we hope to install a shared battery to support grid harmonization and to allow for islanding during power outages. Next. So the transformation story here is not about architectural design. It's about engaging and serving a population that is both disproportionately impacted by climate change, yet all too often left on the sidelines of the discussion. The neighbors here are the heart of this project. They are simultaneously our clients, our partners, and the subjects of this pilot project. They represent many different cultures, countries, religions. Some neighbors were born and raised in Oakland. Some have lived on this block for over 30 years, and others are recent immigrants who are new to the neighborhood. There are 7 different languages spoken on this block of mostly middle to low income families and individuals. Next. The partnership between the neighborhood and the project team grew out of, I would say, an intersection of goals and overlapping goals. The neighborhood, that was organized by a handful of community-minded neighbors, sought to use this opportunity of the eco-block to promote community. They want to increase communication, collaboration, and have block-wide fun as a way to break down isolation between neighbors. They want to encourage skill sharing and peer education around all manner of neighborhood-related issues, and they want to improve their shared environment. Next. The grant goals, I would say, are also grounded in a commitment to community well-being. With this project, we seek to create an advanced energy community model that equitably decarbonizes an existing underserved residential block, and in the process, strengthen community and resilience. Next. And the resulting neighborhood benefit, in addition to all the grant-funded improvements, which are PVs, home upgrades, all electric appliances and equipment, and renewable energy at a lower rate. In addition to all of that, a benefit is to get to participate actively in tackling climate change through carbon reducing efforts where they live, basically. So much simplified process here probably looks familiar to most of you. After the block was formed, we assessed the existing conditions to determine project goals and scope. We designed, engineered, priced, finalized the necessary construction documents. We secured permits, and we're now in the construction phase with the envelope improvements underway on the first few houses. And so when this is all done, we'll evaluate the project's actual impact. Next. In terms of outreach and engagement in our work with the community, the block's leadership gave us some great advice on how to best engage with the participating neighbors. We limited the number of team members present at any one meeting. We developed clear graphics, avoided jargon, and provided interpreters to make the meetings and their content accessible. We organized hands-on events like the one shown in the center of this slide. This one was about gray water laundry to landscape, a hands-on workshop. And we listened. And with that listening, we also learned to get out of the way when neighbors were helping their neighbors understand the issues and considerations. Next. Knowledge sharing is also a critical piece of our communications effort. To get information out and to do so without lecturing, which was another thing that was important to do here, is we set up a private webpage for the neighbors to share information. We also sent monthly newsletters and are sending monthly newsletters out. And we developed a series of informational pamphlets to help explain the many parts and pieces that are involved in this project. Next. The block also needed an entity for the collective ownership of shared assets. So our team's legal experts helped form a homeowners association that owns, operates, and manages the shared PV array, the electric vehicle and charging station, and if additional funding comes through, the shared battery and microgrid components. So not only are we retrofitting a collection of existing buildings for an all-electric future here, we're also retrofitting an existing neighborhood with an HOA, which is pretty unusual. This AOA formation turned out to be far more straightforward than we first imagined, especially if you compare it to the effort involved so far and looking forward in securing agreements from the utilities and city departments. I'm sure it's no surprise, but when it comes to concurrence, often the smaller the group, the easier the pathway to resolution. Next. In terms of specific upgrades, the building envelope improvements include for each of these houses, air sealing, insulation at the attic and the crawl space, and a vapor barrier below the crawl space. As hard as it was, we ultimately decided not to insulate or to improve the insulation of the exterior walls as part of the typical improvement package. We couldn't afford to do everything, which is often the case on projects. So we chose to cut the wall insulation because it was complicated and costly, and to instead focus on the easier work of insulating attics, crawl spaces, and air sealing. Next. In terms of mechanical and electrical upgrades, we are changing out all of the gas and energy hogs of electrical appliances and lightings to more and to high efficiency units. We're replacing gas, space, and water heating equipment with electric heat pumps that also provide for air conditioning. And we're adding cooktop vents and exhaust fans in each of the house to help with indoor air quality and ventilation. Next. Every participating house, as mentioned, will get PVs on the roof and upgraded electric service and panels if that's necessary, and infrastructure for a future EV charger on each property. So when it's all said and done, we'll remove the gas meter and gas service. Next. The modeled EUI for 18 buildings, 24 units, which total about 20,000 net square footage is 11. And this represents about a 50% reduction over the existing collective EUI of 22. Add to that 100% renewable energy, the project's operational carbon is reduced to 0. Next. As mentioned earlier, not any two of these houses on the block are the same. So just for a comparison's sake, looking at current and post upgrade modeled energy use for two of the houses, you can see that the buildings of different ages, sizes, performance level require quite different levels of investment to achieve the same post upgrade results. The kind of a more poorly insulated and equipped building that's shown here on the left obviously requires more upgrades to achieve a modeled annual energy use of about 13,000 kTPU a year, while far less investment is required or necessary for the better performing existing building on the right to achieve a similar annual energy use. Next. So the CARE tool results show that while the operational emissions are 0 in both the reuse and new building, given the PV array and the assumption of 100% clean energy, the embodied carbon spent in a new equivalent building is more than twice that of the reused building. Next. Stretch that out over 25 years, and the cumulative emissions for the reused house compared to the new is closer to 1/3. Next. So lessons learned, and we've learned plenty on this project, but just to focus on a few of the top ones. The first being, people want to do the right thing, both individually and as a community, but they need to know what to do. And we all need leadership from our government, from our permitting agencies, and from our utilities to do this. In our work on this project, we are finding that, for example, the building and planning department that's responsible for issuing building permits for the shared assets components in particular, and the utility company whose grid needs to interface with these shared assets are simply not yet tooled for this kind of collective approach, much less a mass rollout of this type of work. So we're hoping that this pilot project will help identify the gaps, help streamline the process, and finally help convince utilities and governments that community solar and resilience is in our best interest and is going to require public investment to meet electrification and zero carbon mandates. Next. Another important lesson is to do what's doable now. The block approach needs to be heavily coordinated across disciplines, agencies, property owners, and property lines. There are a lot of moving and immovable parts, and there's a ton of trade-offs. In other words, decarbonization at a block scale is inherently complicated. So keep it simple, keep it smart, keep it effective, and keep the client and budget at the center of the effort. As promising as that next great technology is, it's important to work with available components and what you have at hand, not what you wish you had or what may be coming, because time is of the essence. Next. Another lesson is that we've learned is that being in the conversation and part of the effort that decarbonizes our neighborhoods is an empowering experience, and that empowerment needs to be spread far and wide. It's going to take a lot of work to make this happen in California, where natural gas is piped into most existing homes. And for all of its challenges and the steep learning curve, the EcoBlock is a good model for community empowerment. And finally, I'm sure you've heard this a lot in this particular forum, so here it is again. We architects have a very important role to play here. While energy transition and climate change are happening fast, industry and marketing mechanisms are behind. We as architects are well positioned to push policymakers, regulatory agencies, utilities, manufacturers, our clients, and our peers to implement low and no carbon strategies like reuse and clean electrification. We have the right skills, we see the big picture, we get the details, we can synthesize information and solve problems, we know how to work with people, we know how to manage teams, and we have a significant role. So with that, thank you, and back to you, Larry.
All right, let's see if okay, before I go, actually, I'm going to go one back. Here we go. Key takeaways. So, saving carbon is totally critical for what we need to do, but we also need to do it by transforming the buildings we live and work in. It's not enough just to focus on the metrics. We have to focus on what works for people and what makes people's lives work better. All emissions matter. We have to reduce all carbon emissions, embodied, operational, transportation. One of the things we really learned from doing these tally runs and these care runs is that a lot of times people think that if you're saving a building, that's enough. And it really, the operational emissions really add up, even in a short time period of 20 years. So you pay attention to all of them and you keep going back and checking and make sure you're making the choices that's going to have the most carbon reductions over the next 20 critical years. Susie just talked about it, but engaging and empowering the community, when you do it at a community scale, it happens, but you need to get out of the way and let the community really help lead the project. And I think that really happened at EcoBlock, and it happened at the two other projects we showed, which was really pretty cool. And then again, do what's doable. Do the best with what you have. Don't let the perfection be the enemy of getting anything done at all. So we've got to get a lot done quickly. And finally, Susie, I think, said this also, but we as architects all at this point need to be activists. And I think architects are in a unique position to influence how and what we build, or even if we build. So I'm going to give you one more take, or one more reason to save and transform buildings. We work a lot with data. It's important to measure our impacts if we're going to reduce them. The CARE tool is a data-driven tool that predicts future operating and embodied emissions and emission reductions. But it's also, if you take its name at face value, a call to care for the world we already have, particularly the piece of the world we inhabit, the built world. One of the best books about this is Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. It reminds us we're part of a functioning ecosystem. And as we use the system's resources, we have a responsibility to give back to the system. And she doesn't actually call them resources. She calls them gifts, and points out that in a gift economy, when you receive a gift, you give something back. She's talking about gifts from the natural world, but we would do well to start thinking of buildings as gifts, because that's what they are. The materials they're made from are gifts from the earth. The labor to build them are gifts from the people who made them. We can give something back by treating them with care. Thank you. We'll take questions. We have questions. Oh my gosh, I'm supposed to review all these questions. I don't even know where to start because I was not able to really look at these during this because I'm kind of running the slideshow too. I'm going to put care tool ones aside for the moment. Let's see. Boy, some of these are pretty technical for what we're talking about. With the push to electrification, is there a way to understand the carbon emission impacts of the increased electric generation versus on-site gas-fired systems, i.e. hot water building systems? It seems that shifting the emissions elsewhere until the electrical generation is cleaner. I think that's true. We're definitely working in California where we have a relatively clean grid. But I think that the other thing to say about that is the shift will be easier to make happen if people are shifting now to electric. It's going to put more pressure on the utilities to shift away from gas and more to electric and to cleaner electric systems. So I'm not sure. Allison, you want to say something about that one too?
I can add, like Larry said, in California, our grid is pretty clean. So electrification seems, like I mentioned, like a no-brainer. I think it's important. And I think the CARE tool allows you to do this. Like if you are doing projects in some place like Chicago with a more carbon intensive grid, electrification, you don't want to lock yourself into gas systems, but you do want to weigh kind of the carbon emissions that will result from electrifying your equipment and using that dirtier grid.
Yeah, the other thing on the CARE tool is when you look at a project in wherever, in Wyoming or California, you get really different results because the grids are really different. But you also have to look at the projected state goals for how fast they're going to decarbonize. And then, and if they're going to be decarbonized very quickly, then even with a bad electric grid now, you're basically building, and the CARE tool has the ability to say a high renewable rate or a medium renewable rate or a net zero rate by whatever date you want to pick. It lets you factor that in, and you actually can run the CARE tool with different grid emission scenarios and see what a difference it makes. So it's really interesting to do that. I think we have to assume that all of this is predicated on a cleaner grid in a hurry, and some of that's outside of our control. All we can do is put pressure on utilities and become advocates for it. Let me see. There's just so many questions. Can everybody else see the questions too? If anybody else from our team wants to look at these, can you all look at the Q&As too? Or is it just me?
Yeah, we have access.
Okay, good. So some simple little questions like, I think this is for EcoBlock, are the roofs replaced before the PVs were installed? When they need to be, but most cases they didn't need to be.
Yeah, there were only, I think, 4 total
right
roofs that needed to be replaced as part of this effort.
Right. Let's see. Shades are turning into turning Alameda County block of houses into a Bronx County condo. It's an interesting concept. I like that's the HOA comment. That's pretty good.
It's the HOA comment. And
Yeah.
I think there's a few questions here about the HOA and how is this managed? I mean, it is slightly complicated in that there are assets. I mean, the idea was at first just keep in mind that EcoBlock, this is a research and a pilot project. So we're learning a lot of things as we go. And by the time we get to the end of it, there's going to be a lot of recommendations on how to consider the many topics that have been investigated. As far as the shared resources go, because of certain things out of our control and with the powers that be, that at first, only the roofs that were optimized for solar panels were going to get solar panels, because not all roofs are created equal. Some of those roofs have a lot of dormers. They don't have great solar orientation. So the idea was just to put the PVs and all the PVs we would need for all of these buildings on fewer roofs, and share that asset across the participating neighbors. But because of the way the tariff system is set up through PG&E and the utility, we couldn't quite make that work now. Maybe in the future, things will be changed so that it can be done. So instead, now every participating roof gets a solar panel, at least 1 or 2 or 3, or as many as it can. That information all gets aggregated and then distributed equally among and I think it's based on a square footage. I'm not sure what the metric is, but it gets distributed and equally charged among the participating members. And it was an outside organization that had to help us figure out the program to make that equitable distribution happen. I hope that answers some of your questions. The goal was to install a microgrid where we would use the PG&E's electrical lines that already exist in the neighborhood as the way to distribute power in an islanded condition. And that in and of itself is proving to be an interesting research project in developing the hardware package that is required to make that happen, and then the software package that is required for the distribution. But we're working on it.
All right. I could answer a couple of care questions. There's a few at the beginning. One is the care tool useful for single family residential? It's not a category. The categories are based from the zero tool. And the problem is there really isn't much information on single family. What we use as a default or a placeholder right now until we can get better data in there is we're using, I believe it's multifamily. We just want to make sure we're getting residential energy use, not commercial. So commercial, multifamily residential is going to be different than single family, but it's going to be a lot closer than a commercial project. So that's what we're using right now is what we enter into the tool. We're planning on upgrading that next year to really cover single family residential. Also, do the care tool emissions curves line up with energy consumption curves? This is the difference between good and bad carbon. First of all, the two types of carbon emissions in the care tool are operational and embodied. Operational, we're just basically the operational carbon is tied back to whatever grid scenario you selected and how much a percentage you're replacing it with renewables. But the embodied carbon, there's not a lot of modifiers yet built into it, but there are some modifiers you can add to your reuse project or your new project, which you can select sustainably harvested wood, like FSC wood, and that lowers the footprint comes down. And you can select low carbon concrete as one of your. We only have a couple modifiers in there right now. We'll be adding more as we go on. The Epic tool gets a lot more into that. We're mostly not trying to show you how to design the best possible remodel. We're just showing you why it's better to remodel than build a new. That's the main thing the tool shows. And as we get more into it, we'll have ways to actually have the renovation projects be able to go in and tweak those and make them even lower carbon. Another question was about penetrations. How important they are. And it's true. It's actually really true in this climate where insulation actually isn't that important, but air infiltration on these old leaky wood frame houses we have around here is huge. In my house, when I had it analyzed 15 years ago, it was the single largest heat loss was through air leakage, not through insulation, which didn't exist. So anyway, the tool doesn't get into it specifically. It does get into, recommending insulation, which is connected to air sealing in the tool. But at the moment, unfortunately, the tool can't tie together. I could take off the screen sharing and then you could there we go. It doesn't link together the energy efficiency upgrades with the actual results. You have to pick your own UI you're going for. So that's very hard to do, and we're working on it, but it's a pretty blunt instrument right now, but it actually is very useful at just quickly getting a take on, is it better to reuse this thing? And you know, if you have a building where you're replacing a whole lot of foundations to make the building work, well, sometimes it's not better than a new building, because that's the high carbon pieces of the building. And it's really showing you that if you have a light touch on a building in terms of the intensive embodied carbon portions of a building when you're remodeling, you're going to save a lot of carbon over building a new building. And that's mostly what it does. What else do we have here?
I do see a couple of more questions about EcoBlock that I might be able to answer. One is, can EcoBlock be applied to new tract homes with HOAs already in place? Yes, that is ideal. That is the better way. But the study here, this particular study was, okay, how do we create something in an existing neighborhood where older buildings that are in more need of have more decarbonization requirements than the newer tract homes often do. Right. Solar hot water heating wasn't really considered because of the weight it brings to a structure, and given the efficiency of equipment available on market for water heating and space heating, it was more of an all-in-one opportunity than introducing a new and yet another system to the project.
Yeah, and I would just say, from someone who installed a lot of solar hot water heaters back in the 70s, that it's a more when a solar system freezes on your roof or something, it introduces a little more potential issues for a home ownership of these shared resources. So keep it simple. That's right. What else do we have? Oh, good question about lifespan of solar panels. We don't have that in there yet. Those are all things I think that the CARE tool is designed right now as just cradle to gate. So it's looking at the carbon to get the house built, and figuring that if you're picking a fairly short time frame, particularly, there's not going to be a lot of maintenance and replacement, but it will be there. And if you pick a long replacement period, we really should be factoring in replacement and rent and maintenance on buildings, because there is embodied carbon involved in that. So it's not that we're ignoring it, we just haven't quite gotten to that level of detail yet. Most of the stuff you were talking about can or should at least last the 20-year time frame we're talking about. Although if you're doing a tenant improvement thing, the carpet might get replaced every 5 years, and that's criminal, but that's what's happening.
I'll jump in. I see a couple of others here I missed before on EcoBlock. No, we did not bury the electrical lines. They are still overhead, and they will be repurposed as part of this, or part of this process. In terms of the cost of electric appliances, we did not go for high-end electric. We went for high efficiency and available. And many of the units were bought in bulk by the contractor, which helped reduce cost. For this particular study, this is a grant-funded study. So what the neighbors are putting in right now is their time, effort, and interest. They're not participating financially unless they're having work done by the contractor that's additional to the scope of the EcoBlock. In terms of what happens if somebody wants to buy in or sell out, that's a lot of that is included in the ownership agreement, or the shared ownership agreement, and that was a lot of the conversation. How do we equitably get reimbursed for our investment? How can we buy in? What would it take to buy in? So if a person wants to sell, they can sell their home or get out of the HOA. There is a way to do that. There's a pathway to do that.
Right. There was a question, Susie, about cost to the owner, the property owners for this project. Right now, it's a grant. It's the California Energy Commission is paying for it.
Right. It's
Right.
grant funded, but there will be ongoing expenses. You know, there will be the maintenance expenses moving forward. There will be there will be charges that come with, you know, moving forward, rolling forward, the maintenance of the electric vehicle, for example, things like that.
The goal was, as I understand it, was to keep the ongoing costs lower than the utility bills would have been.
That's exactly right.
That's what they're trying to do.
Another part, I mean, when this project is over, there will be both a case study and a guidebook that that are part of the effort and included in the project. Part of the case study, or excuse me, the guidebook and the case study is different funding models moving forward were investigated. And I think that the reality is that this kind of approach is going to have to take, the utility is going to have a major role in this kind of approach. Number one, there's going to have to be funding available, but there were other models that were set up. If you wanted to do this privately as your block, maybe this is one approach, that you pool your resources or you collectively apply for a grant. There was also discussion about setting up a mission-driven nonprofit that would help organize this kind of work on a block-by-block level. But this is all still very new to the team. We're learning a lot, and there's a long way to go on perfecting this as a system or an approach.
There's a question at the end on the CARE tool. Can you discover that your remodel may increase embodied carbon more than new construction? That is possible, and it's certainly, if you have an intensive structural upgrade to an existing building, and the new building you would build would be a much lighter gauge steel or something else, that's certainly possible. If the structural upgrade is a bunch of shotcrete walls, for instance, and the new building would have been light gauge steel framing, you're probably better off with a new building from an embodied carbon standpoint. So it's not. And do you have more to say on that? I just noticed you said you might have something to say on that too, Allison, maybe. Is that right? I see a little thing down here. Alice is going to answer this question live. Allison.
Oh, I'm just trying to manage the questions and answers.
Okay.
So as you're answering them, I'm ticking them off.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So, but anyway, so that happens, and we've run a number of buildings through the tool and found that the new building was the better solution. It's not that it's always the better solution to replace a building, but it's just pointing out, and as you use it more and more, you start to see what are the intensive renovations that really impact the embodied carbon. And then the other question, which I think most people don't get, and we're really beginning to understand, especially from these three projects, is how important operational carbon is. If you can't improve the operational carbon by a lot in your remodel, you may be better off with a new building. I mean, it's not to say that saving buildings is always the right answer, but what I've been told by a number of kind of high performance mechanical engineers is that most buildings, if you really pay attention, you can make an existing building net zero. It's not impossible. It may be a little trickier, maybe, but it's not. If you're willing to go in there and replace windows and add insulation and do that, it can happen. You can get stuck sometimes with an historic building where you can't do all that, but we're hoping some of that changes too. We don't think historic buildings should be exempt completely from having to upgrade. So anyway.
And if I could just add to that, I think this is true, and we've all said this, but electrification needs to happen with envelope improvement. You can't just go in and change out all the equipment and it's like, okay, sure, you can do that. It's not that that's impossible. You can do that. But the other point to this exercise is energy efficiency is critical. And doing the other thing, you want to get the load down. It's about electricity. It's about operational carbon. It's about all those things. So an important aspect of this is reducing the demand, and right. You reduce the demand by a whole building understanding and participation in that in terms of the envelope and the equipment,
Yeah.
etc.
And I would say, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the greenest building study, came out around 2010. It really, it didn't assume in their case studies, it didn't assume a high level of it. It assumed a 20% efficiency increase for their remodel buildings. And what we're saying and what this tool is showing us and these projects are showing us is we should be aiming for net zero on every project. We're not going to get there on every project, but if that's not our goal at this point, 20% is not even worth doing, in my opinion, really, because the embodied carbon to get there might not pay itself back. So I'm really saying we've got that slide in there that says do what's doable, but on the other hand, your goal has to be, you got to set some high goals, and we really need to focus on operational reductions. The existing building stock is, 95% of everything that's out there is what's already built, not the 5% or the 2% we're adding every year. So we've got to upgrade the existing stuff, and it's all got to get to net zero in the next 20 years. So we might as well start now. Anyway, I don't know. I get it. I think if you look at Europe, I think the energy upgrade programs often target 50 to 75%. In this country, 20 to 30% would seem like a good upgrade. And I don't think that's actually true.
Need to move that needle, most certainly.
Yeah. So. But
Yeah, and I think something that adding to something that Susie said about improving the efficiency of our buildings, a lot of people will say, well, if the grid is clean, it doesn't really matter. But the thing is, to make the grid clean, you're adding all of these solar panels, wind farms, and that takes embodied carbon too. So we really do want to reduce electricity on our projects, and it's important.
Right. Bring the EUI down and then go for the solar, not the other way around. Yeah. Anyway, well, we're maybe running out of steam.
There we go. Sorry, struggling with my camera and my mute button. Thank you guys so much for this really, really fantastic presentation and a really great discussion. Really appreciate you guys kind of moving through these questions and bouncing off each other. And I think it's really great for the attendees too, to kind of be with you through the chat and through the Q&A. So thank you guys again very much for your presentation. For all of those that are still on our webinar today, you will be receiving a ZNCD certificate and a follow-up email from AIA California. So just keep an eye out for those. You should be receiving them the next several days, but via email. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me at any time. Sarah Vasquez, Climate Action Program Coordinator here at AIA California. Thank you again to all of our presenters today. It's Eagle and Strain. Really appreciate your presentation, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So much.
Yeah.